The Homeless Man Wearing My Dead Son's Necklace. A family story told by Eleanor Brooks. The homeless man wearing Evelyn Harrison's dead son's necklace had no idea he was the last member of her family, and she had no idea that stopping her car that winter afternoon would uncover a secret buried for 8 years. If you've ever lost someone and wished for one more chance, stay with me, because sometimes the people we think are gone forever leave behind one final miracle. Evelyn Harrison was 64 years old, the CEO of Harrison Corporation, and for the last 8 years she had lived with a grief so heavy that it changed the color of her world. She buried her only son, Daniel, and she visited his grave every year on the anniversary of his death, bringing fresh white roses because they were his favorite. She sat there for an hour and talked to him as if he could still hear her, and every year she said the same thing: "I couldn't save you." On the afternoon everything changed. Evelyn was leaving a charity luncheon on Fifth Avenue, where Christmas decorations hung from every storefront, tourists carried shopping bags, and a man played the violin on the corner. She barely noticed any of it because grief teaches you how to move through beautiful places without seeing them. Her driver stopped at a red light, and that was when she saw a homeless man sitting beneath the awning of an old bookstore, looking about 30 years old with a worn coat, shoes that had holes in them, and a paper cup with a few coins inside. She probably would have looked away, as most people do, but then he lifted his hand to adjust his scarf, and something silver slipped from beneath his collar. She stopped breathing and leaned forward as her heart began pounding because hanging around his neck was a silver chain with a red stone carved into the shape of angel wings. Evelyn knew that necklace because she had bought it for Daniel on his 18th birthday, watched him wear it almost every day, and 8 years ago she buried him with it. She told her driver to stop the car, and she stepped out into the cold and crossed the sidewalk. The man looked up at her with tired, kind eyes that were strangely familiar, and he smiled politely and asked if he could help her. She pointed at the necklace, and his hand instinctively moved to it as she asked where he got it. He frowned and said he didn't know, explaining that he woke up with it and didn't remember where it came from. The sounds of the city seemed to disappear as she asked if he didn't remember, and he shook his head slowly, saying he didn't remember much of anything. When she asked his name, he gave her a sad smile and said he wished he knew, telling her he had an accident 8 years ago. The exact number hit Evelyn like a blow because 8 years was the same amount of time since Daniel died and since that necklace disappeared into a grave. She looked at the man again, at his face, at the necklace, at the strange sadness in his eyes, and for the first time in 8 years she felt something she had forbidden herself to feel: hope, a dangerous and impossible hope. She suddenly had one question so terrifying that she could barely think it: if her son's necklace wasn't buried with him, then what else had she been wrong about? She should have walked away and told herself there had to be another explanation, a duplicate necklace, a coincidence, a trick of grief, but instead she sat down beside the homeless man. For the first time in 8 years, she couldn't stop looking at someone. I've noticed that grief has a strange way of making us blind to the miracles standing right in front of us. Evelyn Harrison spent 8 years looking at a grave, never realizing that the miracle she was praying for was living on the streets just a few miles away. Sometimes the answers we're looking for aren't in the past, they're in the person we haven't met yet. Evelyn asked him what happened 8 years ago, and he looked down at his hands and said he wished he knew, telling her he woke up in a hospital but didn't remember which one. He said he only remembered bits and pieces: water and rain, and being cold. When she asked what else, he closed his eyes and said a voice, a man's voice, but he couldn't hear the words. He touched the necklace and said that whenever he held it, he felt like someone gave it to him, as if it belonged to someone important. When she asked what people called him, he laughed softly and said no one really did, but at the shelter they called him Ryan, a name he picked himself because it just felt right. A man with no memories, no family, no name, only a necklace that should have been buried with her son. Her phone rang and she ignored it, then it rang again and again until she finally looked at the screen and saw Richard Harrison, her late husband's cousin and vice president of Harrison Corporation. She answered, and he asked where she was because the board meeting had started 20 minutes ago, but she said she was busy, and when he asked if everything was all right, she said no. She told him she found Daniel's necklace, and there was complete silence before he said that was impossible. He asked where she was, and his voice suddenly sounded strange, too fast and too nervous, and he told her to tell him where she was. A chill ran through her because Richard wasn't surprised, he was scared, and she slowly stood, feeling fear for the first time because somehow before she had even explained anything, Richard sounded like a man who already knew exactly why her son's necklace was hanging around the neck of a homeless stranger. Evelyn didn't answer Richard right away. She looked at Ryan, at the necklace, at the strange sadness in his eyes, and she made a decision that would change both their lives, telling him she was taking him somewhere. He blinked and asked where, and she said a hospital because she thought someone there may know who he was. A sad smile crossed his face as he said he had been hoping for that for 8 years. Something inside her broke because 8 years of waking up every morning not knowing your own name, not knowing if someone somewhere missed you, that was a loneliness she couldn't imagine. She ended the call with Richard, and almost immediately her phone rang again but she silenced it. Ryan asked if it was her husband, and she shook her head and said it was her cousin, and he seemed terrified. 20 minutes later they were sitting in the back of her limousine, and Ryan looked uncomfortable as if he were afraid to touch anything. Evelyn suddenly wondered how long it had been since anyone had invited him anywhere. She asked if he remembered the name of the hospital, and he shook his head, but he remembered rain and sirens and waking up in a room with white walls. When she asked if anyone came to see him, he said he didn't think so, only a doctor and a nurse, and no family or friends. The answer made her heart ache because no one should disappear from the world that completely. An hour later they walked into Bellevue Hospital, where the receptionist smiled politely and asked how she could help. Evelyn took a deep breath and said she was looking for records from approximately 8 years ago, and the woman frowned and said that was a long time ago. Evelyn handed her business card, and her expression immediately changed as she asked them to wait. A few minutes later an older administrator approached them and led them into a private office, asking what exactly they were looking for. Evelyn glanced at Ryan and said a man who arrived 8 years ago with severe memory loss. The administrator typed for several seconds, then stopped with his eyebrows slowly rising, and when she asked what it was, he looked at the screen, then at Ryan, then back at the screen, saying he did have a record. She stopped breathing as he told her the date was the night of December 17th, 8 years ago, and her heart nearly stopped because that was the night Daniel died. The administrator clicked again and said male, approximately 24 years old, and Ryan swallowed as the man looked at the screen and said head trauma and near drowning. Then he frowned and said that was strange because the patient didn't have identification, no wallet, no driver's license, no phone, and he wasn't admitted under a name but as John Doe. Ryan looked at Evelyn, and she looked at him because suddenly she realized something terrifying. On the exact same night that she lost her son, a nameless young man had been pulled from the water and was wearing Daniel's necklace. Evelyn took a shaky breath and asked what happened after he arrived, and the administrator scrolled down and said he was unconscious for nearly 2 days. Ryan looked surprised, and the man nodded, saying severe head trauma and memory loss. Evelyn asked if anyone came looking for him, and the administrator frowned and clicked another page, saying yes, there was a visitor 3 days after the patient woke up. The room went silent as she stepped closer and asked who, and he frowned again, saying the name wasn't listed but someone definitely came to see him. He said it was a male, approximately 60 years old, and well-dressed. Evelyn's heart began pounding because a wealthy man at a public hospital visiting a nameless patient 8 years ago couldn't be a coincidence. She asked what happened during the visit, and the administrator clicked another note and said the patient became agitated and started shouting, and he kept asking about someone named Daniel. Evelyn froze, whispering that was her son, and the administrator looked back at the file and said he kept asking if Daniel was alive. Ryan stared at the screen and asked if he said that, and the administrator nodded, saying he also said something else. Evelyn could hear her heartbeat as she asked what he said, and the administrator slowly read the note. Patient repeatedly states, I have to find Daniel's mother. Evelyn felt her knees weaken because Daniel's mother was her, and the room suddenly seemed smaller. Ryan looked horrified and said he didn't remember any of this, but another question had just appeared in Evelyn's mind, how did this stranger know her son? Before she could speak, the office door opened and a nurse stepped inside carrying some files. She looked at Ryan, stopped, and went completely pale, raising a trembling hand and pointing at him as she said she remembered him. Evelyn stared at her and asked if she really did, and tears suddenly filled the nurse's eyes as she said she was the night nurse. The room became completely silent as she took another step and said he woke up screaming, and he kept asking for Daniel, and he kept saying the same thing over and over. Evelyn couldn't breathe as she asked what he said, and the nurse looked directly at Ryan and whispered, "I promised my brother I'd find his mother." The world seemed to stop because brother meant that somehow this stranger and her son had been family. I've noticed that sometimes the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, in whispers, in the tears of strangers who remember what we've forgotten. For Ryan, the truth had been waiting 8 years, hidden behind a wall of silence and erased memories. And when it finally came, it arrived not with a bang, but with a nurse's trembling voice. Ryan looked just as shocked as Evelyn, whispering that he didn't have a brother. The nurse slowly sat down and said she remembered him because he was so upset, and he had just woken up and couldn't remember his own name but kept repeating, "I have to find Daniel's mother." A chill ran through Evelyn as she asked why, and the nurse frowned and said someone gave him something, a necklace. Ryan instinctively touched the silver chain around his neck, and the nurse continued, saying he kept holding it like it was the most important thing in the world. Evelyn could barely breathe because it was Daniel's necklace, the one she had buried with her son. The nurse looked at the administrator and asked if they still had his personal effects, and he frowned and said after all these years he doubted it, but she asked him to please check. Nobody spoke as Ryan looked exhausted, as though every answer was creating 100 new questions. He looked at Evelyn and asked what if the nurse was wrong, what if he knew her son but they weren't family, but she couldn't answer because something deep inside her was beginning to believe the impossible. 10 minutes later the administrator returned carrying a small plastic evidence bag, looking surprised that it wasn't destroyed. He placed it on the desk, and inside was an old leather wallet, a broken wristwatch, and a photograph. The moment Evelyn saw it, her heart stopped. She picked up the photograph and saw 2 young men standing on a beach. One of them was her son Daniel, and beside him, his arm around Daniel's shoulder, stood Ryan, 8 years younger but unmistakably him. Ryan stared at the photograph and slowly sat down, saying no, and Evelyn turned it over to find handwriting on the back in Daniel's handwriting, which she recognized instantly. "First day with my little brother. Best day of my life." Evelyn stopped breathing because it said little brother, not friend, not cousin, little brother. Tears filled her eyes as Ryan looked at the photograph as if he were looking at a ghost, and then he touched Daniel's face with his fingertips and his expression changed. He said he knew him, he knew that smile, and he closed his eyes as the room became very still. He said he heard waves and a bonfire, and he pressed his hand to his forehead as he saw Daniel laughing, teaching him how to skip stones. Tears rolled down his cheeks as he whispered that Daniel kept calling him little brother. The room seemed to stop because for the first time this wasn't just evidence, this was a memory, and memories don't lie. Evelyn looked at the photograph again, at Daniel's happy face, at the words he had written, and another terrible question entered her mind. If her son had found his brother, why had he never told her? Before she could speak, her phone rang and she saw Richard's name on the screen again. She answered, and his voice came through shaky and afraid as he asked her one thing, whether the man wearing Daniel's necklace was standing beside her right now. She didn't answer immediately, looking at Ryan and then at the photograph, and she asked why he was asking her that. Silence followed, and then Richard's trembling voice repeated the question, and Evelyn felt a chill run through her because she had known Richard for 30 years and had never heard fear in his voice until now. She said yes, the man was standing beside her, and she heard him exhale as if receiving terrible news. He said, "Oh God," and she asked what he knew, but he told her to leave the hospital, to take the man and leave because there were things she didn't understand. When she demanded he explain, he shouted no, then lowered his voice and said if that man was who he thought he was, he would come to the hospital. The line went dead. Ryan looked at her and asked if Richard knew him, and Evelyn didn't answer because she was beginning to think Richard knew far more than either of them. The administrator cleared his throat and said there may be something else, that the hospital had security cameras 8 years ago and archived some of the footage. Hope exploded inside Evelyn as she asked if they could see it, and the administrator nodded. 10 minutes later they were standing in a dim records room as an old computer hummed and the administrator inserted an archive drive. One by one, grainy black and white images appeared, and then suddenly the nurse said there, freezing the screen on a man in an expensive suit who had just entered the hospital. Evelyn stepped closer and her heart nearly stopped because she knew that suit, that walk, that face, it was Richard Harrison. Ryan stared at the screen and asked if that was him, but Evelyn couldn't speak because there was something even stranger. Richard wasn't alone. He was carrying a medical folder, Ryan's file. The administrator frowned and said he shouldn't have had access to that, but Evelyn was staring at the screen as Richard walked into Ryan's room and 30 minutes later came out carrying a photograph, the same photograph now sitting on the desk beside them, the picture of Daniel and Ryan. Richard had seen the photograph 8 years ago. He knew exactly who Ryan was. The administrator clicked one more file, a final camera angle in the parking lot, showing Richard leaving the hospital and stopping beside his car, turning to look directly at the security camera, then slowly pulling a folded document from his pocket. The administrator zoomed in, and Evelyn stopped breathing when she saw 3 words at the top of the paper: DNA test request. The room went completely still because 8 years ago Richard hadn't been trying to discover who Ryan was. He had already suspected the truth and had been desperate to prove it. Evelyn stared at the frozen screen, realizing that while she was planning her son's funeral, Richard had been standing in this hospital investigating a nameless young man wearing her son's necklace and carrying a photograph of himself and Daniel, and he never said a word. She slowly turned toward Ryan, who looked pale as if he already knew the answer but was afraid to hear it. The administrator cleared his throat and said she should sit down, but neither of them moved. Her phone rang again, and she answered immediately, asking Richard why he requested a DNA test. A long heavy silence followed, and then he said because he knew who he was. Ryan looked at her, and she put the phone on speaker as she asked who he was. Richard's voice was shaking as he said, "He is your husband's son." The room went completely still as Ryan blinked and said what, and Evelyn couldn't breathe, asking what he just said. Richard explained that he knew the moment he saw the photograph, that Daniel found him. Evelyn whispered no, saying her son would have told her, but Richard said he was going to, that he planned to bring Ryan home on Christmas Eve 8 years ago. He said Daniel had told him that Evelyn had always wanted another child, and Evelyn covered her mouth because it was true. After Daniel was born she couldn't have more children and sometimes joked that Daniel should find her another son, never imagining he actually had. Ryan looked completely lost, asking if his father was dead, and Evelyn didn't know what to say because suddenly she wasn't just grieving for Daniel anymore, she was grieving for her husband too, a man who had carried this secret alone. She asked who Ryan's mother was, and Richard said Elena Moreno, a woman her husband had loved before he met her, not knowing she was pregnant, and he found out only months before he died. This wasn't betrayal, this was a father discovering too late that he had another son and trying to bring him home. Ryan whispered, "So Daniel was my brother," and no one answered because they were all thinking the same thing. If Daniel found his brother and planned to bring him home, why did Ryan end up homeless and forgotten? Richard finally spoke, and his next words made Evelyn's blood run cold. He said after the accident, after Daniel died, he made a terrible mistake. He let everyone believe Ryan was dead too. The room went completely silent because suddenly they weren't uncovering a family secret anymore, they were uncovering a crime. Ryan looked as if he had been struck, asking what he meant, and Evelyn couldn't breathe, asking what he meant by letting everyone believe he was dead. On the phone Richard was crying, and he said after the accident he found Ryan in the hospital with no memory and no identification, and when Evelyn asked why he didn't tell anyone, he said because he was afraid. She almost laughed because her son was dead and another young man had lost his identity, and he was talking about fear. Richard said Ryan's mother came looking for him 3 weeks after the accident, carrying his photograph, searching every hospital in New York, putting up flyers, filing missing person reports, and she came to Richard because Daniel had mentioned him to Ryan. And when she asked for help finding her son, Richard told her there had been no survivor, that Ryan was dead. Ryan closed his eyes as a tear rolled down his cheek, learning that his mother thought he was dead. Richard continued, saying she never believed him and kept searching for 5 years, writing letters every birthday and every Christmas, never giving up, and she always said the same thing, a mother knows when her child is still alive. Evelyn asked where she was now, and Richard began to cry as he said she died 3 years ago. Ryan didn't move or blink or breathe. Then in a voice so small it nearly broke Evelyn's heart he asked if she waited for him, and Richard said until her very last day. Ryan sat perfectly still, a man who had just learned that his mother had spent 5 years searching for him and died believing he was gone. He asked if she suffered, and Richard's voice cracked as he said she missed him every day. She kept his room exactly the same, never sold his truck, even paid his phone bill for 2 years, because a mother had refused to accept what everyone else believed. Ryan broke then, covering his face with his hands and crying the quiet heartbreaking cry of a little boy who had lost his way home. Evelyn sat beside him, and for a long time neither of them spoke. Then suddenly Ryan froze and his breathing changed as he looked up with his eyes looking somewhere far away. He stood abruptly and said he remembered, pressing his hands against his temples as he saw rain, a road, and a black SUV. He remembered Daniel driving. They were laughing, and Daniel said, "Mom always wanted another son." Ryan's voice trembled as he said Daniel wanted him to come home, and then his expression changed to fear as he remembered the headlights of the SUV behind them, too close, and then the impact as it hit them, ramming their car again as the guardrail broke and the car went into the water. He whispered that he couldn't get out, he was drowning, and then Daniel came back, opened his door, and pushed him toward the surface. Ryan looked down at his trembling hands and said Daniel wouldn't come with him, and he whispered the words that shattered Evelyn's heart. "He took off his necklace and put it around my neck. He said, if I don't make it, find my mother." Evelyn understood then that for 8 years she had believed she lost her only son, but with his final breath Daniel had been trying to give her another one. Nobody in the room was able to speak as she cried too hard, realizing her son had died saving his brother. Ryan sat with his head in his hands as the silver necklace rested against his chest, Daniel's last gift. Then Evelyn remembered the black SUV and slowly looked at her phone, asking Richard whose SUV it was. A long pause followed, and then she heard him exhale, and suddenly she knew as she whispered, "It was you." Silence, then he said yes. She asked if he followed them that night, and he said yes. She asked if he hit their car, and he said yes. She asked why, and Richard began to cry as he said he never meant to kill Daniel, he only wanted to stop them from bringing Ryan home. He knew Ryan was her husband's son and tried to keep him away, and when she asked why, he said because he hated her husband, because he spent 30 years helping build Harrison Corporation, always standing in Daniel's father's shadow, and then one day her husband changed his will, wanting both sons to inherit equally, leaving half of Harrison Corporation to Ryan. Ryan looked stunned as he whispered that he didn't even have a bank account, and the tragedy of that sentence nearly destroyed Evelyn because a man worth hundreds of millions had spent 8 years sleeping in shelters. Richard's voice broke as he said he couldn't accept it and thought if Ryan disappeared nothing would change. Evelyn could barely breathe as she said, "So you destroyed his life and my son's," and Richard said he knew, with no excuses, no lies, only guilt. She asked what happened after the crash, and Richard began to cry again, saying he followed the rescue boats and saw Ryan alive, then went to the hospital and erased him, removed his records, paid people, and when he forgot who he was, he let him disappear. 8 years, one man's greed had stolen 8 years. Richard whispered that there was something else, that he still had the letter, the one Daniel wrote to Evelyn and another one for Ryan. Evelyn's heart pounded as she asked where they were, and Richard's barely audible voice said he was at the cemetery sitting beside Daniel. The cemetery was almost empty when they arrived, and snow had begun to fall as tiny white flakes drifted through the air and settled on the rows of headstones. Ryan walked beside Evelyn in silence, touching the necklace as if he finally understood why it had been around his neck for 8 years. Then they saw Richard sitting on the frozen ground beside Daniel's grave, looking 20 years older than he had that morning, with a small wooden box resting in his lap. When he heard their footsteps, he slowly stood, and for a long moment none of them spoke. Then he looked at Ryan and began to cry, saying he was sorry, and Ryan said nothing. Richard looked at Daniel's headstone and said he had said those words 1,000 times but never said them to the people who deserved to hear them. Evelyn stepped closer and said he had something for them, and he nodded, opening the wooden box with shaking hands. Inside were 2 envelopes, one with her name written on it and the other saying, "For my little brother." Ryan's breath caught, and Evelyn felt her knees weaken as Richard handed her hers and gave the second envelope to Ryan. Neither of them opened them immediately, Evelyn too afraid to hear her son's voice again, but finally she unfolded her letter and read Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. "Mom, if you're reading this, then things didn't go the way I planned. I found someone important. Someone I think God meant for us to find. His name is Ryan. He's my brother. I know this will surprise you, but please don't be angry with Dad. He only found out recently too. Mom, you've always said love makes a family, not blood. I think you're going to love him. Evelyn broke because even in what became the last days of his life, her son had been thinking about bringing someone home. Then she heard Ryan crying and looked at him as his hands shook while he read his letter. Ryan, if you're reading this, then I didn't make it. And if I didn't make it, promise me one thing, find my mother. She has more love in her heart than anyone I know. And if she lets you, let her love you too. Then came the final line that shattered all of them. I spent 24 years wishing I had a brother. Thank you for giving me one before I died. Ryan collapsed to his knees, and Evelyn knelt beside him as snow continued to fall around them. For a long time nobody spoke, then Ryan whispered that he had a brother and he never got to know him. Evelyn put her hand over his and said he did know him, for one night, and that one night changed all of their lives. After several minutes Richard stepped forward and looked at Daniel's headstone, saying he would plead guilty and tell the police everything because he had been carrying this for 8 years and didn't want to carry it anymore. He looked at Evelyn and said he was sorry, and she nodded once and told him to tell the truth. Tears filled his eyes as he said he would. 6 months later Richard pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and fraud, resigning from Harrison Corporation as the newspapers called it one of the biggest scandals in New York's business history. But none of that mattered to Evelyn anymore because something far more important happened. Ryan came home, not to a mansion or an inheritance, but to a family. 3 weeks after the funeral, Evelyn took him to a small white house with blue shutters outside the city, Elena Marino's house, where Ryan stood frozen on the porch and said he didn't remember it. Evelyn squeezed his hand and said he didn't have to, and an elderly neighbor opened the door and looked at Ryan, then covered her mouth and said, "Oh my God, Elena was right. She said you'd come home someday." She never stopped believing. Then she handed him a small box that Elena had left for him, and Ryan opened it with trembling hands to find a stack of birthday cards, 8 of them, one for every year he had been gone, with a note on top in beautiful handwriting, "To my son, in case you find your way home." Ryan broke then, sitting on the porch and crying like a child, and for the first time he remembered his mother, not her face or her voice, just a feeling of warmth, safety, and love, as Evelyn sat beside him until sunset. 1 year later they opened the Daniel Harrison Foundation with a simple mission, to help missing people find their families, to help the homeless rebuild their lives, and to make sure no one ever disappeared the way Ryan had. On opening day when reporters asked why he started the foundation, Ryan looked at Evelyn, then at the silver necklace around his neck, and said, "Because someone once saved my life and asked me to find his mother." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. That Christmas Eve they visited Daniel's grave, and Ryan removed the necklace and gently placed it on the headstone, whispering that he thought this belonged to him. Evelyn picked it up and placed it back around his neck, smiling through her tears and saying, "No, my son gave it to his brother." She took Ryan's hand and said she lost one son 8 years ago, but she thought God sent her another. He stared at her with his eyes filled with tears, and for the first time he called her what Daniel had hoped he would, Mom. They both cried, and somewhere in the quiet of that snowy evening, Daniel smiled because after 8 long years, his little brother had finally found his way home. I've noticed that some people lose their names, and some families lose each other, but love has a strange way of finding its way home. It may take years, it may take tears, but it never forgets the address. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't ask for an explanation, it simply opens the door and says, "Welcome home." This has been a family story with Eleanor Brooks. Until next time, take care of each other.